Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Kim Weichel. Kim, you and I have known each other, gosh, I don't know, somewhere 35 years or so, I think now. My recollection of you is that we went on a camping trip together early on, and I think we tried rafting or something, or tubing. And that was my first kind of experience of you, was you were a good playmate.
Thanks, Nori.
Yeah.
And I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate your inviting me for this talk on my very favorite topic.
The topic is finding and fulfilling your life's purpose. And obviously the overall theme that we're dealing with is for how to create heaven on earth. And that as each one of us does this, and I think you and I are two people who have found and been fulfilling our life's purpose for a long time, I think that you have a lot to say. So I would just love to have you jump in and tell us about the work you're doing now.
Well, again, thanks, Nori. So I've always been purpose-driven ever since I was young, and I find that's my motivation, my driving force in my life, and it gives me a sense of, well-being for sure. So I have what I call 3 legs to my stool of my life, my foundation, that are core to me in my sense of purpose. One is to promote women's leadership and agency and women's voices, which we'll talk more about because it's been a long-term passion in my work in the world. Secondly, I'm an avid peace builder, and so promoting peace in a variety of ways. And thirdly, spirituality, which is really core to my life. So those 3 intersect, and the values that are inherent in those 3 are so aligned. So the values of empathy, of compassion, of being relational and caring about others, about thinking long-term, not just short-term, and holistic thinking, about being inclusive, about being engaging and being thoughtful of others. And so these are really core peace building skills. And that's why I feel women in many ways are the peace builders, why I've worked and for most of my life supporting women's voices to be heard, to be included, because I feel these are what society needs at this time. So what I've been doing in the last many years is all of that, is promoting peace in a variety of ways through my work over my lifetime in South Africa, with Russia, with many countries with conflict. I've worked with women. I lead women's leadership training. I've mentored hundreds of young women for the past 25, 30 years, because I really believe that women's voices, young women's voices, need to be heard. They're often a little tentative, and by giving them just a little mentoring and coaching, it really can help them in their life. And then I also have worked a lot in what's called here, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, in terms of advocating on policies and legislation that support women's empowerment. So I was part of the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. I helped lobby for the Women, Peace and Security Act in 2017. I've been also advocating for CEDA, which the U.S. has not signed, which is the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So a lot of these kinds of policies that are really needed, and that we can have a voice, which is why I felt called to be here in Washington, D.C. to work on some of these issues. I've been part of a coalition of civil society leaders for 10 years under the auspices of the U.S. Institute of Peace, working on the Women, Peace and Security agenda with U.S. government agencies to ensure that they include women in all aspects of development aid and humanitarian aid, in diplomacy, in engaging women in all aspects of peace building. I've also encouraged women to be stepping into politics. And there have been a variety of barriers, as we know, and now more women are stepping into politics. Thank goodness. We need more women in politics now. So that's been a big part of my work. The last number of years, the last 6 years, I've actually written 3 books. I just had another book come out this last summer. My husband and I co-teach at the Lifelong Learning Institute at American University on a range of American cultural issues. And I've been involved directing a mentoring program to encourage young peace builders to develop peace building projects in their respective countries. So all of that and more, but I'll just stop there. And that's some of what really drives me and what I love to do.
So a question, how did you get into this initially? What was your family upbringing like? Did you have brothers and sisters? And I mean, where did some of these interests become sort of present in your life?
Well, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, had a wonderful family, one brother. But Nori, it's not necessarily from my parents. There was some seed in me that was passionate about all things international from a very young age. I used to pore over maps. I loved geography. I was really intrigued by different cultures. I loved to go to exhibits at different museums. I loved the tea ceremonies of Japan and all kinds of things. I befriended the exchange students at my high school. I wanted to become one. I did in 1971. I went to Germany. I'm still very close with my German family after 50 years. I'm delighted to say it's been a remarkable relationship. And so I've just had the seed of wanting to be involved internationally. And that year in Germany was kind of a launching point. But then I've had so many other, major experiences that help be the foundation of my life's work.
And so in South Africa, you were involved quite a bit in South Africa. What were the years you were doing that, and what was your involvement there?
So yes, I was gonna share that next. So my husband and I actually met and married in Sydney, Australia, in 1974. And so we journeyed on over to Africa, did a 6-month journey through East and Central Africa in 1974. It was our honeymoon, amazing experience, and really set the foundation. I mean, we're still married after 47 years, so I'm delighted to share that. And we ended up in Cape Town, South Africa at the end of 74 during the height of apartheid. So the only way that I could really live there, of course, was to get involved. And I did enroll at the University of Cape Town to complete my degree. I also did my master's there. But shortly thereafter, I got involved with some of the protests that were happening on campuses around South Africa against apartheid. And then after I also simultaneously was working on my degree, but I became regional director of this national program called the Institute of Race Relations. We worked with employers to open up their workplaces. I did a lot of cross-cultural training because there was a lot of tension, different genders, different ethnic groups working together, obviously in very segregated societies, in how we could, desegregate those workplaces. I worked with consulates and embassies to get realistic information out about South Africa, because of course the apartheid government was not giving realistic information. It was very important to create a presence and a pressure outside the country as well as from within. But I also was very involved in a very large-scale squatter community on the outskirts of Cape Town called Crossroads. About 20,000 Africans lived there. Just like in a lot of the world, people in the rural areas couldn't find work. The apartheid government had these, useless areas where they would send most of the Africans in that they had no work opportunities. So they came to the cities to find work, but had no housing. So they had to live in these large squatter communities. But the government wanted to demolish Crossroads. So I worked with a small team, a lawyer, an academic, a journalist, and myself, and we stood against the apartheid government, and Crossroads was never demolished. And it's still existing today, as a matter of fact. I mean, it's been upgraded, but sadly, it's still existing today because housing is still tight in South Africa. It's a country very close to my heart, but it gave me the grounding for citizen activism and to see that our voices matter and that we could stand and that we could see how important it was to take a stand. I mean, I knew my phone was tapped. I didn't want to become banned, but I was a strong activist for 5 years. We lived in Cape Town, and I wrote a book published by McGraw-Hill documenting the whole story about Crossroads and about a lot of what was going on in South Africa. I actually did my master's thesis, very controversial at the time. I employed, mixed race and African people and talked about their actual working conditions in the workplace, never been done before. It was sent to the parliament for them to read about what the actual working conditions and pay scale was of many African workers. So I did a number of things, and I was then on the first USAID project to South Africa in 1982, and have stayed in touch with all things South Africa all these years later, and we hope to go next year as well. So that was a really foundational part of my work and commitment to building peace.
And then you also were involved in citizen diplomacy, as I was, in the Soviet Union. Tell us about that experience.
So in the early 80s, many of us, you, me, many people were really worried about the buildup of nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union, in the US, pointing at each other, this incredible polarization. We didn't know what our governments were going to do. It seemed like war was maybe imminent. So what can citizens do? I couldn't necessarily influence my government. So a remarkable woman named Sharon Tennyson, who founded the Center for Citizen Initiatives, decided, I'm going to take some ordinary Americans and go over and see for ourselves. And they did. And that really launched the citizen diplomacy movement. And then you and I and hundreds of Americans went over. My first trip was in 1986. It was profound for me. I looked at a lot of the stereotypes and misinformation in our media about what was really like there. We met with ordinary Russians around their kitchen table, realized that our hopes and dreams were so similar. As a core cross-cultural thing, I teach cross-cultural training, which is our similarities are always greater than our differences. And that was so true there. So I went on to lead 3 citizen diplomacy trips in the late 1980s. Then that evolved into a range of skill building programs. I worked with Center for Citizen Initiatives over a 10-year period. We launched an economic development program that trained Russian entrepreneurs, brought them to the US for a 1-month internship around 260 American cities. They stayed with Rotarians. They had this internship with like-minded companies, and they went back through thousands of entrepreneurs that came to the US, and it really helped jumpstart the Russian economy. It was extraordinary during the very difficult 1990s that they had. So the program had a huge impact. We also launched an agricultural initiative during, again, the challenging 90s when people had very little food. We taught them how to grow their own vegetables, rooftop gardens. We sent over shiploads of seeds, did a number of things to build up the agricultural system there. We launched an environmental program. They had no really environmental awareness, particularly to clean up Lake Baikal, which is one of the largest lakes in the world. We launched a nonprofit management initiative because there were hardly any nonprofits at that time. And so we helped really foster a whole nonprofit sector in Russia. And we launched a micro enterprise program for women. This was at the beginning of the Grameen Bank model of micro enterprise programs and giving small scale grants to women. In this case, we had a business incubator in St. Petersburg. We had sewing machines set up so that they could come and make clothes and sell them. And really, all of this had a ripple effect. But the most important thing is you saw what citizens can do when we cared. And the power of citizen diplomacy, it is one of my core mottos in my life. When the citizens lead, the leaders will eventually follow. We have a role as citizens. We are all citizen ambassadors when we travel, what we do. And so I have held that motto throughout my entire life. So that was really, again, foundational to see things from a very different perspective, to take action through all of these initiatives and to see the positive effects that it had. I'm still involved with building, connections between Russians and Americans, even today in this very polarized world that we're in.
Now, you also got involved with the Great Law of Peace. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yes, yes. And I love to tell the story because it's a very important part of our American history that most Americans don't know. So I work with an organization called the Center for Spiritual Democracy. Love that name. And we studied the whole Iroquois Confederacy. So briefly, in the 1600s, 1700s, there were 6 Iroquois nations in upper northeastern US and southern Canada. They were warring nations until a man that became known as the peacemaker traveled, brought his message of peace to these nations, and he created their constitution, the Iroquois Constitution, which is called the Great Law of Peace. And he developed core principles, checks and balances. Very importantly, part of the checks and balances is he included the role of women as clan mothers. Clan mothers were the elder women in the community. They had certain powers. They selected the chiefs. They helped the community develop the policies. And very importantly, if the chief didn't carry out the policy as the community wanted, they could depose him. Don't you wish we had that power today?
The women also had the role of declaring whether they were going to make peace or make war.
Exactly. So the role of women was really instrumental, and there were a number of components about the good mind, about many things that Native American, the Iroquois Confederacy in particular, that they valued, that they included in their constitution, and it was what kept them living in peace for 200 years. So
right.
Our founding fathers researched the Great Law. They learned from the Iroquois chiefs, and that's why we have checks and balances in our US Constitution. Very important. However, big however, they did not include the role of women.
Right.
And that has been to our greatest detriment. And in fact, I had the great fortune of traveling for 10 days with an Iroquois chief, Chief Jake Thomas, with 2 other women, 3 of us women. They were called the clan mothers. We traveled for 10 days with him. He taught us about the journey of the peacemaker. We went to a lot of these places, the birthplace of the peacemaker. We went to Cornell University, their Native American program there, where Chief Jake spoke, and we learned so much. And he kept saying the reason that the society's decline is that the role of women was not strong anymore. And so it was, again, such a learning. And I just want to add that the Great Law of Peace was very influential, not just for the US Constitution, but for the development of the United Nations, because it was the only union that had survived in peace for hundreds of years. As well, that our suffragettes in the early 1900s had no other role models other than the clan mothers to say the clan mothers had this power. So the suffragettes learned from the clan mothers and the role that they had. And I think that gave them impetus to do what they did. So it was very influential. Most Americans don't know this history. I have a chapter in 2 of my books about the Great Law of Peace, why it's so important to learn from this, why it was so successful, and its influence on our country.
That's great. Did you ever meet Paula Underwood?
The name is familiar. I'm not remembering it right now.
Well, she and I were related, actually. I think it was 9 generations back, because we both had ancestors who came over on the Mayflower. But she was much more interesting because on the other side of her family, it was Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee. And so she grew up learning the Iroquois tradition as, stand on one foot and speak as an Iroquois, stand on the other foot, speak as a North American. Right. And she and I became very close friends. She wrote a book called The Walking People that might be very interesting for you. It's a big, thick history of the Iroquois people, an oral history, which she got guidance for the first time to take that down and put it into book form. So anyway, we share an awful lot here in common. I never have gone to South Africa, but I definitely did a lot of citizen diplomacy starting in 1982 in the Soviet Union. And of course, were you involved in the planting of the Great Tree of Peace on the Mall in Washington, D.C.? That was something Paula organized.
Yeah, I certainly knew of it, but I wasn't here then.
Yeah.
So, there have been so many remarkable initiatives, and so, I've learned from each of these. Each of these have been powerful seeds in my development. Exactly. But I'm really committed. It was interesting, Nori, because Chief Jake was going to do a film. We were going to film him, and we actually hired a film crew who went to meet with him as an advance to set everything up for the film. And the night before the filming was to start, he died of a massive heart attack. And it was profound, but it was almost like he gave us the baton to say, you women that traveled with me, I am passing this message to you to live this, to ensure the women, he kept saying the women need to get strong again. The women need to get strong again. And that has been one of my mottos of my life, one of my key purposes. So it is from Chief Jake, and I thank and I honor Chief Jake for all that he taught me and the wisdom, but passing that baton to us to say, don't lose that message.
So did you all do a movie?
No, because again, the intent was to film him sharing the great law, and he passed. And so we did not do the movie. I would love to have seen it because I would love to have this history known by Americans. Well, I think there would be much greater understanding and respect.
Well, maybe that's something that's there on your purpose line for doing something. Because, no, seriously, I have a role also I've played in the Native American, down here in Ecuador, where I've been living now for some time, there is a legend of the eagle and the condor, that someday the eagle and which represents the north, and the condor will fly together, and then there will be peace in the world. And I've been very much part of that, and also had a very interesting connection with the Hopi starting back when I was 8 years old. But that's so I would love to have that conversation with you. Maybe there's something we can collaborate on here with this. It would be an awful lot of fun and very, very worthwhile. You mentioned you had written 4 books, and you mentioned one of them was published by McGraw-Hill about South Africa. What were the other 3 books?
So my first book, because of these experiences that I've shared, my time in South Africa, my experiences with citizen diplomacy and the great love, peace, and more, I had girlfriends that said, Kim, you've been involved in some remarkable times in history. You've seen the backstory. You ought to write it down. And several people said, but I did what a lot of people do. Oh, my story isn't that important, blah, blah, blah. And finally, I heard it from several people. I thought, I got the message. And I started writing. And I never stopped. And I realized how much I had to share. So my first book is called Beyond Borders. Let's see, it's right here. I'm going to read it. It's called Beyond Borders. Here it is. One woman's journey of courage, passion, and inspiration. And it described some of these experiences in much greater detail, but also very personal experiences. So we adopted a girl when she was 12. She's now 33. So, the journey of adopting an older girl, an older child, about my experiences of motherhood. I have a biological son and the adopted daughter. The experience of my mother's death, because I was very, very close with my mom. And so that was profound for me. And my spiritual journey, so I had about 20 chapters. So it was a memoir-like book. Wasn't exactly a memoir, but it told my story. And so one of my messages is to write our story. Everybody has a profound story, and it's important to do it before we can. So that experience was such a journey of self-exploration that I could look back and relive highlights in my life. And it was so positive that it led me to write the next book. The next book is called Our Voices Matter. And it was called Wisdom, Hope, and Action for Our Time. It came out in 2016. And the essence, again, is that each voice does matter. It's important for us as citizens. It's both our opportunity, but in some ways it's our responsibility to speak up when we see injustice, or to stand up for what we believe in, what we're passionate about. And we each can do it, and we each should do it. And so I talk about a number of issues in this book that I've worked on for years: violence against women. I have one on climate change. I have a number of different topics and ways that people can get involved with these issues. So Our Voices Matter was my second one. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, in early 2020, as this was beginning to unfold, I started asking the question, what does this really mean for us individually and collectively? And so I started writing about many aspects of this extraordinary time that we've all experienced. And I looked at, for example, how do we live in peace personally during times of crisis? Because we'll all have times of crisis, not just the pandemic, health crisis, relationship crisis, job loss crisis. How do we still maintain an inner sense of peace? I looked at this book, and this is my recent one. It just came out, Uncovering New Possibilities, Insights for Our Time. And I looked at, for example, women's leadership. What was the common bond of countries that handled the virus the best? And that was women leaders. And so I looked at, New Zealand and a lot of these countries, Scandinavian countries, Germany and others. What were the components that of leadership qualities that were important during a crisis? And a number of other topics. So I've developed
Before you go forward, what were the leadership qualities that were critical?
So one is empathy, something that women generally do well. Some of like the head of New Zealand would go on Facebook Live and say to her population, her constituents, this is hard, but we're in this together. And I have your back, and we're gonna get through this together. Things like empathy was important, trust, to being able to trust. That many of them took bold and decisive action. They believed the scientists and health experts, unlike our president. They moved quickly to get testing happening. So a number of things that are needed in a crisis, but you need to trust your leaders. You need to feel their empathy. You need to know that they're on top of things, that they're turning to the health and health experts and scientists to help solve this issue. They're working with international organizations like the World Health Organization, not pulling out of it like we did. And so these are the many steps that help these countries get through that virus very quickly.
Okay, so now if you were going to encourage people, since a bunch of your work is about helping people find and fulfilling their life's purpose, what kind of advice do you give to people watching this summit for finding and fulfilling their life purposes?
Well, we all have interests and passions. And I think it's important to really be aware of what is it that we're passionate about. Sometimes in the busyness of our lives, we suppress them, or we say, I don't have time for it. But I recommend have some time in silence, take a long walk by yourself, get in touch with those issues that call you, what motivates you. Look back over your life and what are those things you've wanted to do but maybe haven't been able to do. What, like, are you really concerned about the environment? Are you concerned about gun control? Are you wanting to be a passionate parent? I mean, there's so many different types of purpose, and purpose can change, I think, over our lifetime. I think we can have multiple purposes. Being I'm a passionate parent, and yet my kids are grown. I was always passionate in my career, but I'm now in a new stage of my life where I choose what I want to do, which I love. I've always really chosen what I've wanted to do, but it comes from a deeper place. It's like my guiding light. And I think we all have that if we tap in. So it's a sense of feeling empowered when I step in and I'm on my path. It's also a sense of inner fulfillment. But I think importantly, as a democracy, it's important for all citizens to step up and be involved, not be passive and wait for somebody else or get frustrated with things, but think my voice doesn't matter, because our voice does matter. So that would be my big message, is to say each of our voices matter. Look at, for example, Malala Yousafzai. Look at Greta Thunberg. Look at their voice. Look at one person, what one person can do. We see a lot of individuals that are speaking up now and creating ripples of change all over. So maybe we're not going to change the world ourselves, but collectively we can. Collectively, we're a powerful influence, many of us, when we speak up and be engaged. So tap into what it is that really is interesting to you. Maybe you don't have time with a full-time job, but maybe you can volunteer on a weekend with an organization. Maybe you can write some letters. There are always things we can do to be involved with our own sense of purpose, which really can be our guiding light. Are
there any other particular, that's great, Kim. Are there any other core aspects that you see that you think we need to carry out as individuals and collectively in order to create heaven on earth?
Well, firstly, let me just say that one of the things I also do is I lead workshops called the Third Act for Women, about women 50 and older, designing the rest of their lives, basically. Now that we're all living longer with more medical advances, perhaps more life savings, that we may be living 30 or 40 years beyond retirement. So, it's a really, we're the first generation, really. Our grandparents, and maybe even our mothers, didn't have this luxury of living longer and having this extended time. So in the workshop, we talk about the psychology of satisfaction. One of the 4 keys of happiness as we age is meaning and purpose, having a sense of purpose. Because if that really gets us up and gets going in the morning, because if we have so much free time, some people are overwhelmed. What do I do? Having a sense of purpose can be that driver in our lives, because it also, I think, relates to resilience, which is a very important skill, a factor, shall we say, as we age, because it helps us ride the ups and downs of life. As we know, as we get older, health issues, friends die, etc. How do we ride those waves? And having a sense of purpose and being resilient are really, really important. But why don't you ask your question again? I've now forgotten your question.
It's any key things you see that we need to do in order to create heaven on earth. And you mentioned the importance of older women, for example, that you do workshops now, trainings with women to help them find and fulfill their purpose, because as older women, I would say that we have a lot of wisdom and knowledge and experience that can be deployed in some amazing ways. And so I think it sounded as if you had 2 or 3 other things that you were going to mention as key factors.
For me, it's the core value. I'm going to go back to where I started. Those core values that I call feminine principles, meaning women's leadership skills, and not all women necessarily embody them. Some men do too, but these are what I call, and which are also the peace building, which are also the spiritual values. I think if each of us embodied empathy, being relational, being compassionate with others, experiencing love and gratitude, thinking long-term, not just short-term, not just what's in it for me, but what's best for others, what's best for all of us. If that attitude existed more broadly, we would take better care of our environment. It is the antithesis of Trumpism, of what everything Trumpism stands for, in my view. It is really what it is that's best. How do we take a stand that helps create heaven on earth for all of us? And it starts from these values. I love the word Ubuntu. That's from my South African background. Ubuntu, again, a South African word, which means I am me because you are you. And so it is the inextricable nature of us. And if we see each other as our brothers and sisters, not an enemy, not hate others, all of the negativity that exists in our society, it just saddens me so deeply. But I live my life on very different principles. And I think these core peace building, spiritual women's leadership principles and values, to me, if we all could embody them, we would be a very different, happier society, much more fulfilled. So to me, it's embodying those things that are really important.
Do you see anything that we can do now that would encourage and nurture embodying these principles much more widely and much more quickly?
Well, there are a number of ways. I mean, there's a lot of great books out there. There's inspirational poetry. There's, I don't know if people are involved in a spiritual community and, get support if they're going through a hard time, perhaps to get some spiritual guidance, to have perhaps a friend, because we don't have to do this alone. If we're having a hard time or feeling frustrated with others, to just get some support. And because I think there's so much goodness, there's also a lot of really bad things going on. And the only way I can personally handle it is to maintain my core foundation, which is my core principles, remembering there is goodness, seeing it, being grateful for what I do have. And I think there are ways of nurturing that, perhaps keeping a gratitude journal and remembering every day, thank goodness for my good health. Thank goodness for my family, etc. There's so many things. If we look for the goodness, we can find it. But unfortunately, a lot of people are not there. And so if we can turn our attention to what works, and being grateful, practicing gratitude, I think those things really are helpful.
Do you see the changes that we need to make in order to arrive at a condition of heaven on earth, that we can make the changes within the current system? Or do you think that we need to create a new model, a new system, something different that's maybe more from the ground up, embodying these principles from the ground up in a new set of institutions and systems?
Really the latter, the latter, because we live in a patriarchal system where, money speaks. There's a lot of greed. There's just a lot of negative values. And, the value that more is better. Why is more always better? Why do we need more things? Why, so I think that's why I go back to the importance of women's leadership and those core values. If we lead with those, if we had a society that prioritized education and paid teachers what we should be paying them, if we prioritized these, childcare and all of those things that are important to make a society work, we would have a different kind of society. So part of it is on us, that we've prioritized, yes, people want the opportunity to make money, but it isn't, the goal is not about how much money we make. And I think we've gotten off on a bad track as just such a highly individualistic society where we worry about ourselves so much, as opposed to how do we take care of others. And I think the pandemic has been a really interesting time to say, are our neighbors okay? We have an elderly woman across the street we've been taking care of, looking after each other, making sure our families and our friends are okay. So that sense of community, I think we all hunger for a sense of community. And so having that as the core principles in our society, again, with women leading, where we value the things that help each of us, that changes things. And I don't know that we can get there from where we are with kind of this old paradigm system. Maybe we're moving in that way, but we have a lot of dark things going on underneath that worry me deeply. And I think we need a shift in thinking and in leadership and in capabilities that are about uniting and community building.
Do you think that there's a chance that we might have women leaders at the national level in terms of a woman president in the next few years?
I certainly hope so. I thought we were going to have Hillary Clinton, and that didn't happen. I'm asked, I give talks all the time to a lot of groups internationally, and everyone says, why is the US one of the only countries in the world that hasn't had a woman president? And my answer really is, we still have a lot of sexism in our culture. We have a difficult situation with childcare. If you've got a mother with younger kids, how can she, can she get the help she needs to be able to take on the job of being president? But you've got so many stereotypes, and it's about power. It's about many, many components. And I hope so. We now, of course, have a woman VP. I'm hoping that our society will be ready to have a woman president, because I think things will change. We're seeing more women step into leadership in companies. There's research to show that when women are on boards of directors and in leadership positions in companies, the companies are more profitable. So for me, this isn't just a women's rights issue, although we're half of the population. It's a sustainable peace and prosperity and well-being issue. It benefits everyone when more women are in positions of leadership. In fact, there's research to show the more gender equality in a society, the greater the level of well-being. So this is about well-being. And so I really hope that we will have a woman president in the near future.
So a question for you. Do you have any other message that you'd like to put out there as we wrap up this interview? I thank you so much for all the wonderful work that you've been doing over the years. Is there a final message that you would like to give to our audience?
Your voice matters. Your voice matters. And so everyone, not to think small, think big. Really think big. Don't have to do things alone. Collaborate with other people. Step into that really which calls you. It's important that you do. We need you. We need your voice. And I think if people saw that their stories matter, their voice matters, that we need to try and be the best people we can be to create the society that we want, which is heaven on earth. So I really encourage people to not think small, think big, take action, and be proud.
Go for the gold.
Go for the gold. Yes, indeed.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Kim.